My name is Mary Warner. I'm Executive Director of the Morrison County Historical Society. You are joining us for the second in our Exploring History and Culture in Central Minnesota series. And this year it is our February event series that is hosted annually by 4 Central Minnesota County Historical Societies, the Morrison, Benton, Sherburne, and Stearns Historical Societies. This series seeks to foster greater understanding and awareness of cultures that have been and continue to be part of Minnesota and its history. This year's programming is presented by the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, HMML, at St. John's University in Collegeville, Minnesota. And today's program is The Boy from Buckman Plants a Seed. There will be 2 more programs that will occur on February 19th and 26th, so please be sure to look for those as well. In addition to our online Saturday programs from HMML curators, each partner site will have an exhibit of manuscripts from HMML for 2 weeks. From February 5th through the 17th, exhibits will be at the Stearns History Museum in St. Cloud and our museum at the Morrison County Historical Society. Our museum is the Charles A. Weyerhaeuser Memorial Museum in Little Falls, and those exhibits are up now, so please come in to see them. They are just jewels of manuscripts that are on exhibit with us. Exploring History and Culture in Central Minnesota, Hill Museum and Manuscript Library event series is made possible by the voters of Minnesota through a grant from the Central Minnesota Arts Board, thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund, otherwise known as a legacy grant. And we thank our Central Minnesota Arts Board and the legislature for this funding. So today's event, The Boy from Buckman Plants a Seed, we really wanted to be able to host here from Morrison County because the boy from Buckman is from Morrison County. This will feature the beginnings of the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library. HMML's work today relies heavily on the early work of the monks at St. John's Abbey to make microfilm copies of manuscripts. The library began work in April 1965 in Austria, led by Father Oliver Kapsner, OSB, born Leonard Kapsner in Buckman. This presentation will tie together Father Oliver's start in Central Minnesota and his career documenting and preserving books in Austria and elsewhere. This program is being presented by Dr. Matthew Z. Heintzelman, Curator of Western European Manuscripts and Special Collections at HMML. There will be a question and answer session at the end. Please use the chat for your questions, and for those of you who are not familiar with the Zoom controls, if you move your mouse, you will have a bunch of tools at the bottom of your screen, including mute, stop video, which most of you know about already. You'll be able to see a list of participants, and then there's a little chat button, which will open a chat screen on the side, and you can type your questions in there. And then we also have a live transcript feature, so you can press the CC live transcript button and you will get the transcript at the bottom, and you can also do reactions, which is a little like emojis that show up on your screen. So remember, question and answers at the end. And I also want to point out that we have a number of folks joining us who are related to Father Kapsner in some way, shape, or form, whether they're actually relatives, or we had one couple who signed up this morning who said that they were married by Father Kapsner. So we want to welcome those folks to our program. And now I will let Dr. Heintzelman take it away. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Mary, and thank you for this opportunity to talk a little bit about one of my favorite topics, which is just how this whole business got started back 57 years ago now, and Father Oliver's role in all of that. I think so much of what we do today is something that we just couldn't imagine 60 years something like this could have happened. I'm going to share my screen and will periodically probably leave the share in order to show things with my hands. But I have far too many slides to show in one presentation, so I'm hoping I can continue to keep people's attention throughout this presentation. starting with the first slide, which shows Father Oliver and his team working with the microfilm readers and cameras in Salzburg, Austria in the late 1960s. So let's see, get into my, there we go. And I wanted to start just by giving a little bit of a sense of how I was approaching this presentation today. I did not write out a full prose text. What I have are notes, and I have lots of pictures because I wanted to try to do this in a way that would be, in a sense, having you come to the library. That much of the time when I give these kinds of presentations, it's for people who have come to St. John's, to the campus, in order to visit the campus, to see the great architecture here, to learn about monasticism, to learn about the school. And I wanted you to sort of picture yourself being here at the library. Here you see a picture of our subterranean resources where we are, with this wonderful classroom area where we are able to bring students and visitors in direct contact with materials that are hundreds of years old and give them the opportunity to learn a little bit about these things right there in front of them, and not to see them as something just far away. We have over 11,000 rare printed books in our collections. We have hundreds of manuscripts and archival documents. And these are the kinds of things that are much more immediate when you can actually have them in your hands and you can actually see them up close. And so we do these kinds of presentations. We also have exhibits and things. And I'm hoping that the people who are visiting us today electronically will sometime have the opportunity to come to campus, see the St. John's Bible, see the exhibits at the Hill Library, and just become part of one of our partners in our mission. So before I turn to Father Oliver's story, I thought it would be useful to just say quickly what exactly the mission of the Hill Library is. The Hill Library works to make copies of handwritten books, handwritten materials, because each handwritten material is unique. And so what we have done over the past 57 years is take photographs, not try to go out and take other people's materials. We don't go out and try to buy other people's manuscripts and history. But what we do is we make photographs so that there's a second copy somewhere else in the world. And we try to make these things available so people can find them. We catalog them. We've got online resources so people can look them up. And then those people who want to do research with these materials can then find out that there is a copy out there that they can actually get a digital copy of many of these things, or they can see digital copies on the web. And that makes it possible for these things to be studied and for us to understand our history and our cultures. One of the great things about it, and this all goes back to Father Oliver's initial work, some of the main things is that he was able to work with the manuscripts on site. That is to say, when he went to Austria, he was photographing these things at the various libraries where they were held, rather than bringing them somewhere else, thus endangering them or bringing them away from the people who have cared for them for centuries. And that everything we do is done in partnership with the libraries that we have worked with through the last few decades. This is a really important part of our mission and our mode of operation, how we do things. So what exactly do we mean by a manuscript? Well, a manuscript, especially for Father Oliver, is essentially a book that was handwritten. If we think of what a printed book looks like today, something that we go to Barnes and Noble or another bookstore and buy, we have an idea of what a book looks like. It has a title page, it has printed pages, it's bound into a little thing called a codex, these got covers. Well, that's essentially what Father Oliver was looking for, except he was doing it with handwritten books. Before 1450, all books in Western Europe were written by hand, and even into the 16th and 17th centuries, many books were still copied by hand, and that was the main way that people would have access to books. And here at St. John's, even into the 19th century, there were monks who would copy out whole books to have their own copy of a book that had not yet been published. And so it was a practice that carried on into the late 19th century. And these are the kinds of things that we would try to photograph, because every time you handwrite a book, it's going to be different from other copies of the same book. Books that we take for granted as having absolute perfect texts are things that often came down to us through hundreds of copies, each copy different from the other, and scholars would have to figure out what was the best version of it. And so by making copies of these books, we make it possible for scholars to compare the different copies and to come up with what they think is the best version of a text from long ago. Just to give you a little taste, there we go. Just to give you a little taste, I have two manuscripts here to show you very quickly. This one is what's called a Book of Hours. This is a very fancy book. This is the kind of book that someone who had lots of money would buy. It has prayers in it and psalms and things like that. This is made with the same technology as what you may have heard of, St. John's Bible. These are made on parchment pages, animal skin. It's made with gold leaf. It has lots of beautiful ink and decoration. This is a very, very fancy book. And some of the books that Father Oliver photographed in Austria were books like that. But most of the books were more books like this. This is a collection of sermons, a very simple cover that was put together in the Middle Ages. And as you go through the book, you see that the handwriting differs, the color of the ink differs. What you have is basically a book that was put together of lots of other different things, so that probably dozens of people were involved in the making of one book. This is a lot of what we photograph. These kinds of things are unusual, and these are the things that people would like to study to understand cultures from different times and different places. And that's what we continue to do today. Today we have, we've photographed over 300,000 materials digitally, and those materials we are gradually making available online. The stuff that Father Oliver did was done on what's called microfilm. And the microfilm, I'll show you quickly, is this. This is what I do in the classroom sometimes. I will take a microfilm and I will hand it out to the people, the students or the other visitors, and I will give them the opportunity to hold this up and to just see what they did was they just photographed the pages of the book, mostly in black and white, because black and white film was very stable and would last a long time. But they made a lasting copy, something that could be around for 200 years that people could read and have available. Today's digital photography is much nicer, but in 1965, there was no digital photography. Microfilm really was the only way that you could see something like this and not be in the location where it was actually housed. So that's a little bit about what we do. Now I'm going to go back to my slides. I'm going to put these books on a cleaner space than my desk. Okay, so Father Oliver came from a farming family, and the Kapsners are a well-known family in central Minnesota. There are lots of Kapsners, and it started with Franz Kapsner, who came over in 1874 with his wife and with several children. I believe they had 9 children already at that time, and had 2 more after they moved to the area near Piers. They bought a farm there. And after a while, the oldest son in the family, John Kapsner, is the oldest child, started his own farm and his own family. And his farm, as you see on the plat map here, was just north of Buckman. And Buckman is a small gathering of buildings, a small town, which is just a few miles southeast of Little Falls, which is really the heart of central Minnesota. It's really right in the midst of things. And so coming out of this very simple background, Father Oliver, or as he was known when he was born, Leonard Kapsner, was the 10th child out of 12 in his family, which is pretty amazing. These farm families often had 10 to 12 children in each family. John and Mary Kapsner did basically the same thing. They had a large family. Many of their children ended up becoming Benedictines. And with the Benedictines, it was really an important aspect to the life for their family. Father Oliver says with a certain amount of pride, I think he says, "It was my good fortune to be born into a large Christian family, being the 10th of 12 children. Of the 8 boys, 3 became Benedictine priests, while one of the 4 girls chose a career of a Benedictine nun. Religious vocations were somewhat of a tradition in the relationship. Of 10 children in my father's family, 2 became Benedictine priests, while all 5 girls joined the Benedictine convent, one of whom was the Reverend Mother for 18 years over a community of 800 sisters." So as you see, this aspect of the connections between the Kapsners and farming families in central Minnesota and St. John's and the monastery of St. Benedict in St. Joseph were very, very powerful. These were long-standing traditions. Father Oliver was born in 1902. He would have been born about the same time that this church was built in Buckman. This is St. Michael's. And this is where he would have attended church, and the parochial school connected to this church is where he attended the school the first few years of his life. He attended parochial school there from 1908 to 1916 before going on to school at St. John's Prep here in Collegeville. And he describes his life in Buckman this way: "Somehow everything seemed to be meted out in the right proportion. Food, clothes, work, recreation, spats, and prayer. Ours was the most intimate and happy family circle, yet not the clannish type. Memories of my school days are likewise very pleasant, beginning with the day my older brothers and sisters conducted me at the age of 5 to the entrance of the parochial school in rural Minnesota. That was in 1907. Later, it says he started school in 1908, so I'm somewhere in there. Were my lads in grade school, high school, and college, who somehow knew how to make the most of the little that was presented to them for training. While I always loved study in the classroom, I also showed considerable interest in sports, be it baseball, basketball, football, tennis, or handball. Dearth of material even enabled me to act as captain of the varsity baseball team one year. Fishing and hunting were never my line, though other members from our family were fascinated by those wholesome sports." So there you get kind of a picture of a young lad from central Minnesota who really is into sports, but is also into books. And he takes this a long ways. So moving on to his life at St. John's, he came to St. John's in 1916 to go to the prep school, and after 4 years there, he took 2 years of classes at the college, and then entered the novitiate, that is the process to become a monk, in 1922, and made his profession as a Benedictine monk in 1923. So here you see his picture from the 1922 edition of the Sagatagan, which is the yearbook at St. John's, where his nickname is, it says that he's from Buckman, Minnesota, but also his nickname is Kaps. And that's interesting insofar as Kaps was actually a variant form of the name Kapsner. So it wasn't just an abbreviation of his name, but it was a form of the name that appears in other sources. And I love the description, which you can probably read, but I'll read out loud here. Cap is of a different strain. He is a smiling cherub with a dozen little devils away back in each eye. Therefore, a man's man is Cap, an athlete and a scholar. He looks not at the moon when it is white, but at wine when it is red. And I think these themes come through his life in Austria as well. He had to be fairly agile, By the time he went to Austria, he was already in the age group that I am. He was in his early 60s. I'm in my mid 60s. And he had to do a lot of transportation and a lot of work on his own, that he had to be in good shape, but he also had to be able to relax and find ways to enjoy himself. After going through the novitiate, he then went into the seminary, and he was in the seminary for the latter half of the 1920s. And you see him here in this picture with the class from the seminary. He finished seminary in 1929, but after the third year of seminary in 1928, he was ordained. And as part of, just after his ordination, he celebrated his first Mass. And to do that, he went back to his home area. His first Mass was celebrated in Piers. And here you see him with family members, including some of his brothers and uncles and one, at least either aunt or sister, who became a nun. And so you see this connection going back to where he was from, being maintained. In the course of the 1920s and the 1930s, Father Oliver taught history. I believe he taught philosophy. He he was the head librarian for many years. He was teaching at the prep school, teaching at the college. In those capacities, he also would do things like he was the faculty member responsible for the reading club. So that interest in books, trying to foster that interest in books among students as well. This was an important aspect to his work here on the campus. In 1939, he stepped down from being the head librarian to becoming mainly a cataloger. There was a lot of work being done to catalog Catholic theology at that time, and his strong suit was in cataloging. A lot of his contributions came through bibliographic work and cataloging work. So someone else took over, Father Benjamin Stein, and he remained as the head librarian for decades. But Father Oliver spent a few years, about 4 years, cataloging the theology collection at St. John's, before he then, in the course of World War II, entered into the military service as a military chaplain, and spent from 1943 up until 1946. He was a military chaplain stationed in Europe. And even during that time, he was at places like, I believe he was at the Battle of the Bulge. He had received an award, I believe, from Belgium for his service in the military. And he continued on in Europe for a few years, a couple of years after the war ended, including having some time to attend the trials of some of the Nazi leaders in Nuremberg in 1946. And those experiences were then passed on to the students back here at St. John's, to the student newspaper. And what you're seeing are excerpts from the student newspaper. He also was able to visit with people like Teresa Neumann, who was a German mystic who had the stigmata, that is the marks of the crucifixion on her hands. St. Francis was another person who reported that. And this was part of his experience of becoming more and more familiar with life in Germany, life in Europe. And finally, in 1946, he did return to St. John's, and he was here for about 4 years before he moved on in 1950 to become, again, a cataloger, working first at the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. for several years, and then finally at St. Vincent Arch Abbey and College, which is in Pennsylvania, near Pittsburgh. He was at these places for about 14 years total, and it was from St. Vincent's that he was called back to St. John's to be involved in a project that involved microfilming manuscripts overseas. So he was not the instigator, he was not the person who came up with the idea of microfilming these manuscripts. As we see, his role will be really the most formative one of all the people involved. So moving on to planting the seed, and especially helping it to grow, Father Oliver was in Pennsylvania at this time, and at St. John's, we were going through a very ambitious period where there was a lot of building going on. Some of you who are familiar with St. John's know this is a period that new buildings were being built that were designed by a famous architect, Marcel Breuer. There was a brand new Abbey church, brand new part of the monastery, brand new dorms, brand new science building. And in the mid-60s, the most ambitious thing they were working on was a brand new library for St. John's. And as part of that library, they felt that there needed to be special projects, special things within the library to give it a program to make it more interesting. And here you see in this brochure from about 1964, they have 4 projects that they're listing. One is something called the Kritzik Collection. This is a collection of signed documents. They're signed by European rulers and by popes and saints. And these are original documents. And these are now part of the collections here at the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library that I am responsible for. So I make these available for people to see. The second item on the list is the Monastic Microfilm Project, which is today what we call the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, or HMML. The Virgil Michael Liturgical Institute never really happened, so that was one thing that didn't take off. But then the Ecumenical Studies Center still exists today and now is known as the Collegeville Institute. So of these 4 items that were meant to be housed in the library, 3 of them are still very much a part of life here at St. John's. And the one that really grew exponentially and required its own space after several years was the Hill Library. Part of the issue in getting this to happen was to find monasteries that allow us to microfilm the manuscripts. And remember that in this time, it would have been much more difficult to obtain information about these things. You had to go to look through books, you had to go write letters, you had to contact scholars who had visited these libraries. There was no internet, there was no World Wide Web. There were no ways for you to just Google the information and find something. You had to actually be involved in it directly. But Father Oliver came into this in early 1964. Here you see the people who were kind of the founding instigators to this project. Father Coleman Berry, here the center photo, was really the person that was his brainchild to get this going. And Abbot Dvorak was the one who had to provide resources from the Abbey to make it possible to do. And the main resource that he offered was Father Oliver, who took over and had to work out the logistics of how to get to these places, to do the research, to find out what they had. He had to meet with people who would provide the technical support, arrange for funding. There was an awful lot that had to be done all in that time. And in late 1964, he went over in August of 64. No, I'm sorry. He went over in early October 1964 to try to get the project going. They had a letter from Monte Cassino, the famous Benedictine monastery in Italy, that they would be allowed to microfilm the manuscripts there, the letter from the abbot of Monte Cassino. And as it turned out, when Father Oliver got to Monte Cassino, the archivist there overruled his own abbot and said, no, you can't microfilm our manuscripts because we can't have laymen coming in, and Father Oliver would need to hire someone to the monastery, and they can't spend months working with these films. And so what happened was that when Father Oliver first got there, he had one disappointment after another. He had 2 or 3 Italian monasteries who said, yes, they could microfilm the manuscripts for us, but we couldn't microfilm them ourselves. And then he was rejected by libraries at Monte Cassino and also in Switzerland, where he spent much time trying to get permission from monasteries at Heintzelman and Engelberg. In late October 1964, the forces here at St. John's decided it was time to get some good press out of this. Let's try to make this project really well known. And so they put into the like what you see here from the Minneapolis Star and into other press releases, they put out that St. John's was going to be doing this wonderful project where they were going to be microfilming all of these Benedictine manuscripts from different libraries in order to preserve them for history and make them available to scholars. The problem is Father Oliver at that time didn't have anybody who would let him microfilm their manuscripts. And so they were putting this out there and putting him in a little bit of a jam because, of course, he didn't have anyone to work with at that point. He didn't have any permissions. And as a very last resort, he traveled from Switzerland to Austria. And he was very fortunate that when he got to Austria, he actually got some support from the Austrians. Initially, he did not. So his letter, let's see, his letter from Austria says that, let's see. So he says, thanks to the highly successful trip, and surprisingly so, through Austria, the news release, which you see before you, is now not disturbing as it might have been had the Austrian contact been a failure. All the 16 abbeys which I contacted have agreed through signed agreements, through signed statements to join our microfilm project. This in spite of an earlier decision made at a meeting of the Austrian abbots not to join. Their decision was based on several objections sent in by librarians. So it was the librarians that didn't want us to do the work. Actually, I have not found a single abbot who is opposed to the project. The difficulties always come from the librarian or archivists, 4 that I know of, all of whom I converted except one at the Abbey of Admont. And there the abbot overruled his own librarian. And that abbot also told me that if it had not been for my personal visit, the project would never have won approval in Austria. And then he closes with saying, the weather was miserable throughout my Austrian journey, but hospitality was grand without exception. The Austrians are a most congenial and delightful people everywhere. Well, the theme of bad weather comes through in lots of his accounts of what happened. I won't dwell on that part, but he does talk about the fact that to get to these monasteries, many of which were out in the country, not near a train station, you would have to use whatever transport would get him close to it and finish by walking, often in the rain or snow, just to get to the place. When he came to Austria, he stopped at a couple different libraries first and did not, while they were supportive, they did not agree to it. And finally, he came to Kremsmünster Abbey. And he describes his arrival as follows. When I arrived, the porter immediately told me that the abbot wanted to speak to me. And here you see a picture of him on the left at Admont, at Kremsmünster. It says, the abbot wanted to speak to me on the phone, whereupon I was set for the next treat of bad news. But his first words on the phone were, Willkommen in Kremsmünster. Sie werden in Kremsmünster anfangen. Welcome to Kremsmünster. You will begin your work here. Brother, what a day that was for me to hear such good news with my own ears. The abbot, Albert Bruckmeyer, was newly elected 4 months previously in Rome and had been a classmate of Father Vitus Bucher, a member of St. John's Abbey. He said that after all that St. John's had done for them during the hard years after World War I, it would not be right to turn St. John's down now. So these personal contacts to the Benedictines really helped bring the work forward. And that work would not have progressed without a lot of technical support and financial support. The technical support was brought by this man here, Eugene Power, who was the head of University Microfilms in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And he was the one who arranged for cameras, he arranged for microfilm readers for the film. He worked out the details of getting the film developed, where the copies of the film would go, all of that kind of stuff. Helped with training the technicians who would help take the pictures. The other person who was vital to getting this work done was Al Heckman, who arranged for the funding. Al Heckman was the head of the Hill Family Foundation, today known as the Northwest Area Foundation. And it was really his support that continued on for years that eventually led to our library being known as the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library. Initially, it didn't have a name like that. It was just a monastic manuscript or monastic microfilm library. So this is part of what made it possible for us to do our work. This next part, excuse me, this next part I will go through fairly quickly. This is basically the procedure of what they had to do and what the work that was involved. These pictures were taken at the third location where Father Oliver and his team worked at the Abbey of Zeitenstetten. And it just gives you a rough idea of what we still do today in some ways. I should mention that you see Father Oliver first selecting the books from the library. This is a monastic library, and typing up information about the manuscript, so we would have some basic information to identify what was on the microfilm. And if you think that seems like an easy job, I should mention that we still have the cards that Father Oliver typed up, and he typed up, if I can get this in front of the camera, he typed up thousands, tens of thousands of these cards on a typewriter, with sometimes multiple titles, sometimes with only maybe one or two titles on each card. But this is the kind of day-to-day work that he had to do, with this detail-oriented work, to get that information so that we would be able to share these things with others around the world. So that's a large part of the work that became vital to what we do. So then they would gather up, he and his colleagues would gather up the books and bring them to the, so to speak, studio, that is to say, to the part of the monastery that might have had enough electricity to be able to run the cameras and the transformer and all the stuff that they needed. And then they would prepare the books to take the photographs, marking where there might be images that would be worth photographing in color, although the entire book would be photographed in black and white. They would set up their equipment. They would take the pictures. Here you see one of the technicians at this table. You see that there's a glass plate over the table to hold the pages flat because the camera could only focus so well. Those of you who can get to the Stearns County Museum to see, there is a camera on display there, which weighs about 20 pounds. So these things were quite heavy, quite solid state. You see that the camera is actually just one small part of the apparatus. There's a tall tower here for the camera to be on, to be able to move it to focus. There's a transformer over here to try to get the electrical supply to match the equipment, because the cameras came from the United States, so they had to take whatever the local power supply was and transform it into something that their own equipment could take. And the lights, lighting system to get even lighting on the camera itself. There you can get another image of the camera with all of this vast equipment that had to be carried in by hand. And that's the kind of thing that Father Oliver dwells on when he talks about, getting the work going. After the film was developed, the pictures were taken. They would mail them to Kodak Company in Vienna, and the pictures would be developed and then sent back to them. They would look at the negatives and make sure that the pictures were in focus, that they had photographed everything, and then those would be sent back to Ann Arbor in Michigan, where the copies would be made, one copy for St. John's, one copy for the monastery where the pictures were taken, and then the negatives of those pictures would be stored in Michigan in order to have things in separate areas to protect them. When I visited one of these abbeys, in Gutweig Abbey, in 2013, I was able to see one of the microfilm readers that they were using back in the 1960s still there, still the microfilms that we made still there in their collection in case a scholar needed to consult them. And once the films were mailed off to UMI, then they would get in their VW van, pack up all their cameras and microfilm readers and other equipment, and drive off to the next library and continue the work there. And in a sense, that's very much what we still do now. We make these, we select the manuscripts, we collect whatever information about them we can, and then we photograph them and we bring photographs back here, and then the process of preserving those photographs and making them available to people and cataloging them is all being done here through the work at St. John's. So now I just want to give you some highlights of some of the places where we worked, some of the things that we photographed. Starting with our work at Kremsmünster. Excuse me as I flip through my notes here. Here we go. So as you heard, the Kremsmünster was the first one. The abbot overruled his own librarian to get permission. And while we were there, Father Oliver would have been working at this beautiful Baroque library built in the 18th century. And they would have been photographing books like what you see here. This is called the Codex Millenarius, which is roughly 1,000 years old. And it is what's called a gospel book. And at the beginning of each of the gospels, so it has the 4 gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And at the beginning of each one, there's a depiction of the evangelist. So here you see the evangelist Mark. And we know that this is the evangelist Mark because over here, you see a picture of a lion with wings. You know it's a lion because he has a mane. Okay, that is the symbol for the evangelist Mark. Each of the evangelists had a different symbol. So instead of putting the name there, they would put the picture, and the picture would identify who it was you were looking at. There are slightly varying accounts of how the work in Kremsmünster started. This was the very first place. What was involved in doing that? Father Oliver wrote up a very nice account of how his work started, which focuses on some of the technical aspects. So he talks about the shipment of equipment from Ann Arbor arrived in Vienna in early April 1965. So before, when he got this permission, it was November 64. April of 65, they're ready to start work. The equipment has arrived. His friend Eugene Power has come to help train the team. And Father Oliver says, after some bickering with the customs people, a usual experience whenever we brought in new equipment, especially a camera, everything was cleared and the shipment was transported to Kremsmünster, where it was set up for operation. A temporary drawback there, which usually occurred whenever we moved to another abbey, was to get hooked up with sufficient electric current. So if you can imagine, to us, it's just, the outlet's there, we plug it in, we go to work. No, they had to find sufficient electric current because these countryside monasteries often only had electricity in a couple of locations in the building. Our 2 cameras each operated with 4 300-watt lamps. In other words, we needed Starkstrom, that is high voltage. In order to get this, we had to lead a 100-foot cable from the kitchen and through the windows to our level. To obtain the properly adjusted operating electric current, we had to transport a heavy transformer, which took 2 men to lift. In addition, 2 men were needed to move the 8-foot metal mast on which the mounted cameras were raised and lowered for proper focusing. Likewise, it took 2 men to carry the tables. So in other words, there was a lot of physical labor that went into this effort. And obviously Father Oliver was very concerned about how to get this in place and how things would work. Now, it's kind of fun for me, and this is the first time I've had a chance to share this little bit in a presentation. But there's more than one account of how these things took place. And while Father Oliver's account is quite accurate and quite true, this is the account that is offered by his friend Eugene Power. And central to this are, of course, the two people over here. This is the abbot, Albert Brookmeyer, who gave the permission. And this is the librarian. His name is Willebrod Neumüller. And Father Neumüller at first said, no, you can't, you shouldn't photograph them. But then when his abbot said, yes, you must let him, suddenly the librarian was like, oh, okay, sure, okay. And then he was very cooperative. And he was the one who actually arranged for Father Oliver to meet the librarians and abbots from other monasteries and to get the work going, to actually get several permissions from several monasteries at once. So he became really one of the major figures in the early days of getting things started. A little bit different view of Father Willebrod comes from Eugene Power, who describes his experience this way. So he says, if you remember the picture of the blue Volkswagen van that's appeared a couple times already, he says, our Volkswagen van had been delivered and we planned to drive out to Stift Kremsmünster, Abbey of Kremsmünster, and begin setting up shop. However, Father Oliver tried to discourage my wife, Sadie, from going along. So Eugene Power had brought his wife, Sadie, with him for the trip. And Father Oliver said, after all, this is a monastery. You can't get inside because women aren't allowed and there isn't much to do in the village. So I suggest you stay here in Vienna. But Sadie wanted to come, so of course she did. Father Willebrod was not at the monastery. The librarian was not at the monastery when we arrived in a cold March rain. He was traveling to visit another library and was not expected back until the following morning. So after unloading the equipment and leaving Father Oliver and his assistants, who would be staying in the monastery, Sadie and I drove down to the village to find a Gasthaus, a hotel for the night. In the village, I spotted Father Willebrod walking up the street towards the monastery. I stopped the van and hailed him, and he came over and wrapped me in a mighty bear hug. He accompanied us to the Gasthaus to see that you get a good room. While we were getting settled, I asked, Father Willebrod, would you be interested in a little bourbon? Well, he answered, I might have just a little for medicinal purposes. A little later, he said, I must be in worse shape than I thought. I need another treatment. The three of us who were enjoying a lively conversation when Father Willebrod pulled out his watch and eyed it. Well, since I don't have to go back to the monastery officially until tomorrow morning, I think we should have dinner together, he said. He took us to a small restaurant tucked into the outer wall of the monastery. When we were seated, he announced that we must have some wine before dinner. We had a 2-liter bottle of Austrian white wine, which I thought was okay since it's quite low in alcohol content. We had 2 liters more with our meal, and afterwards 2 liters more. As we were drinking this third bottle, Father Willebrod began relating some of the history of the monastery. Father Willebrod, only one woman has ever been allowed inside Kremsmünster, he said with an apologetic nod to Sadie. She was the Queen of the Belgians, and she was allowed to do so because she was a king. Sadie is a king for me, Eugene Power declared. After that, Father Willebrod addressed Sadie as Mrs. King. So they continue on, and next thing you know, Father Willebrod led us into the night. His robes flapped in the damp wind as we marched through the medieval gates of the monastery and across the worn cobblestones of the inner court, stopping at a low, heavy wooden door set into the wall. He stooped to open it with a large key. Inside, a narrow stone staircase led upward. We followed the wavering beacon of Father Willebrod's flashlight up 3 musty, winding flights. Pausing at the stop and putting his finger to his lips, he whispered, "They're all asleep in their cells." Then he proceeded to show us through the entire monastery. It was eerie, but fascinating. So as you see, the way things were done to get things moving were not always entirely in line with what the public could see, but there was a certain aspect of the people doing this, and Father Oliver, I think, was a big part of that, made it really very lively, that there was a real kind of fondness and enjoyment that they were getting out of this work, and out of this opportunity to work together. So now I'd like to just kind of give you a quick overview of the results of our work in Austria, the kinds of things that we found, places where we work. And first, I just want to give you a little bit of an overview of the places that some of the places where we did photograph manuscripts. So here in Vienna, we did several large libraries, the largest being the Austrian National Library, where we did over 13,000 manuscripts, which is today still, I think, probably the largest collection that we did in one place. But the other collections that we did, the Makitarists, you see their library here in the lower left corner. They gave us a large collection of materials that were in Armenian, which foreshadowed in some ways the work that we do today in the Middle East. We photographed all of these in black and white microfilm, as well as a certain amount in color images. In Salzburg, we worked at St. Peter's Arch Abbey and at the university. Again, over about 1,500 manuscripts in all of these collections. In Innsbruck, at the very end of the project, probably the filming was done under Father Oliver's successor, Urban Steiner, but the initial work, the relationships would have been established by Father Oliver as part of his ongoing work when he was there. And then also in Graz, a large city in southern Austria and Styria. We also worked at the University Library, which has a very, very large collection, and then numerous smaller collections and monastic collections close to Graz. So in the end, they photographed nearly 30,000 manuscripts from across Austria. Really quite an amazing feat when you consider this is all being done using microfilm, taking it very quickly. What happened? They also worked in monasteries. So the monastery, the Abbey of Admont, which has one of the most beautiful libraries in the world. Melk Abbey on the Danube, and St. Florian, an Augustinian house. And then just a real quick review of some of the kinds of things that we filmed. We have lots of information on travel in the early modern period, people traveling to Turkey, what it was like to be in other cultures, people traveling to South America. This is really a formative time in European history. Encounters with other cultures, non-European cultures, trying to become more familiar with the world. We could study medicine from the Middle Ages, herbals, and books on surgery. We have books on church law and books on civil law. We have books on business, practice of business, and books on mining, things like that, the technology from the 16th century. We have books from across traditions on the natural sciences and astronomy. So you have different depictions of constellations in different languages. So that's really a lot of what really the work that he did allowed us to do, to open up this world, to make these things possible for people to study. And in setting the tone of his work with others, he established a tone for what we still do today, the mutual respect for our partners, the focus on being stewards of these materials and not taking possession of them, not making them our own. I think probably in many ways, Father Oliver was probably a bit of an introvert. I can identify with that. And so when you see him, he's often off by himself, kind of working on his own. Here you see him in Vienna, just looking at a Christmas book in his room, just being very, very simple in his tastes. Though he did like wine. I have to admit, there are pictures of him enjoying a nice glass of wine with others. And after he returned in 1971, then people started to acknowledge his work, the importance of what he did. Here you see Al Heckman greeting Father Oliver when he was receiving his collection of so-called Festschrift, a collection of essays in his honor, along with the abbot of St. John's and the president of the university, and here Dr. Julian Plant, who was the director of the Hill Library by then. Here you see him in April 1975, so 10 years after the start of work, they started building the building we are in now. So at the groundbreaking ceremony, Al Heckman and Father Oliver were also turning some of the soil to get the work started. So that's very exciting. Originally, they said it would eventually be 4 floors, but we only got 2. So we're entirely underground. And then finally, we're coming down to the last couple pictures here. Other acknowledgements of his importance. Charles Kapsner painted a portrait of Father Oliver, which still hangs in our conference room here at the library. And that was donated by the Kapsner family to HMML back in 1981, which is really quite nice. It's one of the best pictures we have of him. And then he even got his picture taken with someone known as the Xerox monk back in the 1970s. There was a Xerox ad done for the Super Bowl. So this is a Super Bowl weekend. Someone pretending to be a monk who had to make 500 copies of something. And of course, he goes and finds a Xerox copier and they make the copies for him. But here you see the Xerox monk seated here with Father Oliver and Father Wilfred Tyson, another member of the HMML staff in the 1970s and 80s. And finally, just a few months before Oliver died, he died in August of 1991, we have this picture of him receiving an award acknowledging the importance of the work that he did in Austria. He received an award from Austria, the Federal Service Cross Award. So his work really, in his lifetime, was already seen as being something foundational. And today, for us, still, it is foundational. And with that, I would like to end my talk, but certainly open it up to questions. And I hope you enjoyed the little bit I had to show here.
Thank you, Dr. Heintzelman. This was a wonderful presentation, just fabulous, fabulous history that you shared and the images that have been captured through HMML and Father Kapsner's work. What I'd like to do at this point is that it is 11:33, so I want to give our sort of official close, and then we will remain open for questions afterwards for those folks who can stay. So I really want to thank you again, Dr. Heintzelman, for your presentation. I also want to thank HMML for providing all of the February event series programming. I need another thank you to our Central Minnesota Arts Board for funding. And I want to thank all of our attendees for joining us today. This will appear on our website and our YouTube channel once Grace works on all the transcript to make sure that it is accurate. We want to invite folks to join us for our last 2 parts to this February event series, Exploring History and Culture in Central Minnesota. That will be February 19th and the 26th. You can sign up again by registering with the email that you use to sign up for this one, staff@morrisoncountyhistory.org. We will be sending an email with a survey to follow up. And also remember that we have exhibits from HMML of manuscripts at, right now, the Charles Weyerhaeuser Museum here in Little Falls and at the Sherburne History Museum in St. Cloud. Those exhibits will then travel to the Benton County Historical Society and the Stearns History Museum for the last half of the month. So be watching for those. So with that, we will let those who need to leave go ahead, and we will go through the questions. I've seen some in the chat already, so I'm going to go back and find one. There was one from Dr. Josh Mugler, who is going to be giving our program next week. Here's his question. The Minneapolis Star article mentions plans to work in the monasteries of Europe and the Near East, but as far as I know, no work was done in the Middle East until 2003. Do you know anything about those initial plans to move beyond Europe?
Yeah, I have to confess I don't. I would have to go through some of the early literature, but I know that there was always interest in working elsewhere. As we know, in 1973, they started in Ethiopia. In the late 70s, there was movement to try to do work in Istanbul, but that didn't work out. But in terms of the Near East, I'm not sure which libraries they're talking about, but we do have correspondence, and I'm hoping maybe Josh and I can look at that. Maybe we can find some leads there.
Okay, thanks. I have a question from Kathy. Can you recommend any books about Himmel and or Father Oliver's work?
I think the best resource for his account of his work was published in this book from St. John's, Sense of Place, #2. It's just a short essay, and if someone's interested, I'm sure we could probably scan it and email it to them. So if they want to let us give us a contact, but it's an article of about 15 pages or so, and that's probably the best account of his work. I don't believe there is a single work on Himmel's, single volume on Himmel's history, but there is a nice timeline on our website that gives a lot of that information.
Okay, thank you. So I have a comment and questions from, I'm gonna try to pronounce this name, Gazwan Boutros. It says here, thank you, Matt. Good to see you again and for a great lecture. My questions: how many monasteries in Austria did Father Oliver microfilmed altogether? And how about his work in the rest of European monasteries? And lastly, was he selective in which manuscripts he filmed?
I'll start with the last question first. One of the cardinal rules that Father Oliver pursued was that they would try to photograph everything in the manuscript collection at a monastery or library, with the idea that we wouldn't determine ahead of time what people would study, that people could come to our resources from different fields and find what they were looking for. So not just pretty manuscripts, not just Benedictine manuscripts, but the initial period was interest in Benedictine libraries. That expanded very quickly in the time that Father Oliver was here to include state libraries, university libraries, provincial libraries, as well as monasteries. In terms of the monastic libraries in Austria, I don't have the raw numbers in front of me, but virtually all of the monasteries and Augustinian houses. So if you go through the various religious orders, the Cistercians, the Augustinians, the Benedictines, Franciscans, Dominicans, Premonstratensians, Father Oliver worked with all of those monastic communities to to microfilm their manuscripts. So I don't know that there were any that were left in monastic hands that were not microfilmed at that time.
Wow.
It would be probably in the range of at least 30 or 40 different institutions.
Okay, I'm just grabbing a few things in the comments here because we have a couple of people who would like electronic copies or copies of the article in A Sense of Place too. So I'm just going to grab those emails.
Okay.
Let me see. So we have some thank yous here.
Oh yeah, I saw one question about Father Oliver's mother's name. I think that was early on.
Okay, go
And
ahead.
her name, I believe, is Mary Kopke, Kopke.
Let's see. Mo Galvin from Sherburne, History Center is just reminding everyone that the Himmel exhibits will move to the Benton County Historical Society and Sherburne History Center from February 19th to March 3rd. So you have the dates. From Kathy, fun fact, I remember that when he sent cards or letters to my dad, his nephew, they were typed. Now I see why.
Oh, yes. Yes. Father Oliver did a lot of typing. And what I found very interesting, and I think this is probably, I've seen this elsewhere in central Minnesota, he was very frugal. And so a lot of the things, notes that I've seen typed up by him that were sent to people are typed on the back of something that had like an announcement or an advertisement or something, that he would reuse the paper rather than using fresh paper. He would just use whatever scraps of paper he had.
Okay, thank you.
Interesting.
Are there any other questions?
I did see that we had a question from John Forrest. Is the program actively recording digital, I assume, today? And if so, where are you working?
I think that's a question for you guys. Where to find the recording of today's session? Is that right?
Yeah, I hope so. So it will be on our YouTube channel, so Morrison County Historical Society, but we also will have it available through our website, which is morrisoncountyhistory.org. Oh, let's see. Oh, too many comments coming in really fast here. Just a second. So Dr. Mugler says, I think he meant, where is Himmel working today?
Ah,
okay.
Yeah, today Himmel is not working in Western Europe as it did back in Father Oliver's day, but is actually very much engaged in various locations in the Middle East and working with partners in the Middle East to digitize manuscripts, as well as different parts of Africa. Our largest project would be in Mali and Northwest Africa, but also South Asia, parts of the Eastern Europe, and also Malta.
Okay. Another thank you. So Barb Weber says his mother was Maria Mary Kapsner. Father Oliver also did a lot of family history. She also wants a copy of the A Sense of Place too.
Okay.
Then I'm grabbing all those email addresses. Another thank you. So let's see, from John, have the original microfilms done by Father Oliver all been digitized by today? So those original microfilms, now are they digitized?
Well, the estimate is that they did several million pages of microfilming in those days. And so it simply hasn't been within our budget to be able to scan them all. And in some cases, the libraries are scanning the manuscripts fresh from the original, so they're doing them in full color with digital cameras. We are, however, able to scan the microfilms for scholars. So if someone requests a copy for their research, what we will do is we will write to the library in Austria and ask permission to make a copy. So this is respecting their ownership. And then when we get that permission, we will scan the microfilm and provide it to the scholar. So a large part has been digitized, but not by any means all of it.
Okay, thanks. Let's see, according to Barb Weber, copies of Kapsner and Kopka history are at the Stearns Museum Resource Center, as many other related family histories are. And I'm sure here at the Morrison County Historical Society, we have a Kapsner file as well. Claudia asks, how many researchers have come to Himmel over the years to use the microfilms?
Oh gosh, it would be in the thousands. We really don't have, I don't have those numbers at hand. Today, it's less necessary to come here because so much can be achieved electronically. But before 20 years ago, before things became so common through the internet and World Wide Web, scholars would have to come here or else go to the libraries that owned the manuscripts in Europe. So in those days, we had many more visitors. I'm sure it would be in the thousands.
Thank you. It looks like, I mean, Anne-Marie has given us addresses for all of our partner places here. And I think we're done with questions. So Dr. Matthew Heintzelman, I want to say thank you once again for a great program, and we will release everyone, and thank you for joining us, and we hope you can join us for the next two programs. Thanks so much.
Thank you for having me.